Hello everybody, this is another film for the Lyceum. This is for the Film Circle, and the discussion will occur via Zoom on August the 18th at 3 p.m. I'm going to talk about truth, authenticity and personal allegiance in fact-based film. It's a common enough happening. You and a friend have a cinema date. Knowing your friend's interest in maths, you suggest A Beautiful Mind, the film about the great mathematician John Nash. Russell Crowe is in the title role. Your friend is appalled. Crowe looks nothing like Nash, she says. Come to that. Crowe looks nothing like any Princeton-trained mathematician. Russell Crowe, she's suggesting, would not be convincing as an intellectual. Your friend knows very little about Russell Crowe, but she does know a lot about mathematicians. This should have steered you to a safer topic, one in which your friend has less of an interest, less knowledge, less personal investment. But instead, you stick with mathematicians and suggest they see The Imitation Game, a biopic of Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician, father of the computer, and leader of the team that broke the Enigma code at Bletchley Park. Your friend is a great admirer of Turing. She would probably say that he, more than any other single person, was instrumental in the Allied victory in World War II. So off the two of you go to The Imitation Game. When the film begins, you are immediately engrossed, but your enjoyment is short-lived, interrupted as it is by derisive explosions that issue ever more frequently from your friend seated beside you. The interruptions become so frequent and the anger of your friend so palpable that you suggest she leave the cinema and wait for you outside. She refuses to leave. Someone has to witness this travesty, someone who has a deep admiration and a deep sympathy for Alan Turing. The two of you have planned a drink and early dinner at Jimmy Watson's following the film. Given your friend's behaviour during the film, you know what's up ahead and really wish you could leave her and just go home. But there's no escape. She hated the film, and she can't wait to tell you why. The film, she said, placed far too much emphasis on Turing's social awkwardness. It made him out to be hardly a social being at all. We today, she said, are so fixated on the autism scale, but it didn't exist back then. Why pathologise the man? He was a genius. Why should we expect a genius, a personal, exceptional, unique, when it concerned maths and puzzles, and probably a whole lot more besides, to be just like the rest of us in the food and drink aspects of life? The film, she said, was indeed a travesty of the great man. It showed little sympathy for what it was to be a homosexual at a time when homosexuality was a criminal offence, and throughout the film his mathematical genius was completely overshadowed by his personal and social deficiencies. Your friend, of course, did not use the word deficiencies. There was nothing deficient in her view of the great Alan Turing. The film, she said, portrayed him as a hectoring, immature, insensitive, idiot savant who was often short on savant. And she added, where was his mother? Apart from one or maybe two mentions, she plays no part in the film, and yet she was solidly central in his life. Your friend is not happy. She seems personally affronted. She is personally affronted. Turing is, after all, a figure in her pantheon of heroes, and the film has done him wrong. But you say, Benedict Cumberbatch was so convincing. He lent authenticity to the role. At least he did, from your less informed point of view. Your friend grants that Cumberbatch showed himself to be a fine actor, one who would have done Turing proud if he didn't have to keep proving throughout the film that he was on the autism scale. You raise the issue of creative license and film as entertainment, but she'll have none of it. If you want to portray a life, then you do justice to that life by presenting it accurately. A life, she said, is a life. But you continue, a film is 90 minutes, a life is several decades, so of course there will be selections, and of course those selections will be made with the mode, film and entertainment, in mind. Your friend is unmoved. If they have to skew the life out of all recognition in order to make good entertainment, then they should have chosen either a different topic or a different scriptwriter. So she says. It's a familiar scene. We've all been there. And it's not just confined to film. Novels that are based on true events and or real people, the so-called faction form, which seems rather a contradictory term, are susceptible to the same conflicts, the same arguments, as are films based on novels. Some viewers of fact-based films or films based on novels say there should be 100% accuracy to the original events or the original novel, but not even a documentary can meet that standard. The fact is that all film selects its scenes from a much larger swag of material available, putting together a 90-minute cohesive narrative of a real story that might have spanned decades. So, to approach the topic from a different point of view, take the issue of translation. Should, say, the English version of an original German poem be a literal translation, word for word, or should it be more poetic? Should it convey the sensibility and lyricism and poetics and meaning of the original poem in such a way that also takes into account the verbal and prosodic characteristics of English, different from German? With a translation of, say, German poetry into English, often a German speaker will provide a literal translation as well as reading aloud the original to the poetic translator. There's two of them. This reading aloud many times will provide the poetic translator with the music of the original, the phrasing, the pacing, the rhythm, the rhymes, if they exist. The poetic translator, who is often a poet themselves, will then take the literal text, the literal translation, and shape it into the English poetic translation. In this procedure, two people, two translators, are often involved. As a poetry reader, I want the sense and sensibility of the original, but I also want to read a poem, and not a literal word-for-word translation of a poem. What works in German may not survive a literal translation into English. Film is a very particular form. It employs a set of tools for portraying a life or a particular historical event. I'm talking about real event, documentary type of film. But the film is a different form than the life itself. The film provides a certain translation of a life or historical event. And unlike the life or event, a film by definition entertains. And I'm not talking here about purely educational or how-to films. I'm concerned only with narrative films and documentaries with a general release. Even if a film were able to provide 100% accuracy, and given its time limits and the limits on perspective, it can't, it has to engage the viewer as well. It has to sweep the viewer up and along. There is a film, in my experience, that comes close to 100% accuracy, although it does not tell the whole story. That film is Claude Lanzmann's Shoah. Shoah is a 10-hour-long film about the Holocaust, shown in 3 parts. Made by the French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann in 1985, it consists of interviews with survivors, bystanders and perpetrators, and as well it enters present-day sites of pivotal locations. The former concentration camp of Treblinka, the now unkempt railway tracks that carried Jews in cattle cars towards the camps. In all the 10 hours, there is no archival footage, no heaped dead bodies, no skeletal survivors standing at barbed wire fences. The film is slow and repetitive. The experience of those who speak, as well as those who can no longer speak, is somehow imprinted on you, the viewer. It is far more powerful, in my opinion, than the Holocaust museums that have popped up around the world. Shoah slows you down. It forces you to focus on singular people, singular messages. It uses elements of filmmaking to powerful and unforgettable effect. For example, the camera looks directly into the faces of those who are being interviewed. You see every twitch and grimace. Sometimes it is as if the scenes they are describing are there on the surface of their faces. Is Landsman's film accurate? As far as it goes, I think it is. Is it objective? No, not particularly. He chooses who he interviews. Is it comprehensive? Of course it's not. It reveals only a fraction of the factual horrors and complicities of the murder of Europe's Jews. The film is, though, I believe, authentic, true to the events it depicts. It is convincing, authentic and convincing. But no, it doesn't tell the whole truth, and while it doesn't lie, a different filmmaker from a different background, although still using interviews, would produce a different 10-hour film and provide a different perspective with different emphases to the viewer. And this film might well be equally authentic. There's much to be said and more to be understood about genocide. So, to this issue of truth and authenticity. They're not the same. I believe that films and novels too that are based on real events and real novels must be authentic, but this does not necessarily mean truthful. To exemplify this point between truth and authenticity, one need look no further than politics. Trump, that's President Trump, lies. His lies now run into the tens of thousands. His avid supporters know he lies. They like that he lies, and that he does it in such a cavalier manner is evidence to them of his authenticity. For Trump followers, essential to their view of him is that he is natural. He doesn't use the same sort of performances as real politicians. He can drain the swamp because he's not part of it. Every lie reinforces his renegade status. Every lie confirms his authenticity to his supporters. Authentic means genuine. It also means reliable and trustworthy, but it doesn't mean good. Indeed, authenticity does not have a moral dimension at all, although common usage has tended to give it one. Trump is authentic. He is genuine, no disguises as far as his supporters are concerned, but is he reliable and trustworthy? Trump thrives on unpredictability. I would say he is predictably unpredictable. As for trustworthy, his followers absolutely trust him, even when they know he's lying. They trust him to be their Trump. To return then to film based on real events and the notions of truth and authenticity. What to make of the recent film, The Favourite? This film is set in the time of Queen Anne, and it focuses on the well-documented relationship between the Queen, her chief lady-in-waiting, Sarah, the first Duchess of Marlborough, and the younger woman, Abigail, who usurped Sarah as Anne's favourite. It was a bit of a romp, this film, even farcical at times. Queen Anne's large weight was a target, everyone's unscrupulousness was on view. Only Godolphin, in charge of Treasury, came off unscathed. As it happens, my oldest friend from school days, Dr. Frances Harris, is a world-renowned authority on the relationship between Anne and Sarah. Her Life of Sarah, A Passion for Government, is at the forefront of works documenting this period. I thought Frances would hate The Favourite. I thought she would judge it to be a wrongful portrayal not only of the main players, but of the times themselves. How wrong I was. And I'm going to let Frances speak for herself. This is what she wrote to me in an email. And I quote, "Everyone thought I'd hate The Favourite." This is an expert on the area. "Everyone thought I'd hate The Favourite, but I loved it. Actually, even before I saw it, which was the first day it was released, having seen the poster, which I now have in my study, a collage of the three main characters, the Queen largest, Sarah in trans riding kit sitting firmly on her knee, and Abigail mutinously on the floor with her lip and her legs stuck out like a discarded doll. That image by itself managed to contain a great deal of truth. That is, that the Queen, pitiable and old and disabled as she was the most powerful of the three and determined the status of the other two, could take them up and put them down as she chose, like toys. The fantastic central performance of Olivia Colman helped a lot. Though the film made no attempt at strict historical accuracy, it did get a number of revealing things right, which historians don't usually bother to mention. That Abigail Masham's husband was actually a toy boy, several years younger than herself, for example. Or Sarah saying something like, "Yes, I'm bossy and disrespectful and impossible, but you know, I am rather gorgeous." I think it's best seen, Frances says, as a kind of extended Gilray cartoon about the gossip and misrepresentation that always surrounded the Queen, that she was too much under the influence of her favourites, an important constitutional issue, though, as an aside, the favourites didn't find her easily influenced. And for those that, like me, didn't know, Gilray, whose dates were 1756 to 1815, was probably the greatest caricaturist of all time. What Frances, an expert in the area, is saying here is that the film was authentic, although not entirely or even mostly truthful. It was correct in terms of the tone and sensibility of the times, as well as general behaviours at court, for example, who was in and who was out. And the excellent performance by Olivia Colman as Queen Anne was crucial to the strength and authenticity of the film. So, form and content, let's have a look at it. Back in the halcyon days of the Melbourne Writers' Festival, there was always a lavish festival dinner. Not anymore. One year, Fay Weldon happened to be the guest speaker. You might recall her book, The Lives and Loves of a She-Devil. This novel was typical Weldon, witty, wicked and wise. The BBC made a marvellous mini-series of it with Miriam Margolyes in the title role, perfectly cast, with Patricia Hodge also perfectly cast. And then, some years later, the Americans, wanting to hop onto a successful bandwagon, did, as they always do, and remade the film instead of trusting that the American viewing public would have understood the British version. The American version was a shocker. All the wit and wisdom was erased to be replaced by heavy-handed humour and plain bloody nonsense. And the cast, Roseanne Barr and Meryl Streep, yes, Meryl in the one bad role of her stellar career, just didn't convince. At the festival dinner, Weldon gave an excellent speech, then invited questions. Someone asked what she thought about the American version of The Lives and Loves of a She-Devil. Weldon paused, such an eloquent pause it was, and then, with an understated, wry smile, replied, "A book is a book, and a film is a film." I vaguely remember she also added something about a pleasant trip to the bank. She is, of course, correct. Novels and films are very different forms indeed. A novel can reveal the inner lives of characters. A novel can show why character X did such and such. It can shift the point of view so we can see the effects of character X's actions on characters Y and Z. The novel excels with interior lives. So this is an issue of point of view. And yes, we get it in film, but in a different way. To give you an example of how powerful point of view is to a novelist, in The Memory Trap, which is the novel before Invented Lives, I have two characters who behave badly, even brutally. There's Elliot, a biographer, and the pianist, the world-renowned pianist Ramsey, who is a genius at the piano and a half-baked individual in every other respect. I did not want them to be baddies, nor did I want them to alienate reader sympathy. I wanted the reader to actually understand them, so I gave both of them the point of view at various times in the novel, so a reader can understand why they behave as they do. The reader, as it were, can get under their skin. As a novelist, if I want to suggest a particular emotion in a scene, I look to certain parts of speech, certain grammatical constructions. I shorten or lengthen sentences depending on the emotion I want to carry. So I have a whole lot of techniques, all novelists do, that you can use to convey certain information to the reader. And this will, in turn, shape reader response. While the novelist looks to grammar and sentence length, to metaphor and verbs to convey, and point of view, of course, to convey emotion and information, the filmmaker has music and camera angles and close-ups, and this too will shape the viewer response. To take an example, there's an argument happening between characters. Quite a different effect is created if the camera takes a wide view and shoots both characters, both players in the frame, or if the camera shifts from one to the other, which I find often really irritating, or if it actually focuses perhaps on the person not speaking. You will have what the camera does will shape the viewer response and the information. And if that then is further amplified by background music, that will supply a certain emotional timbre, emotional information to the exchange. At times this sort of manipulation can be infuriating when the camera homes in on one character and you want to see what another character is doing or how they're responding. It can be very frustrating. And similarly, music can suddenly ramp up the tension, something bad is about to happen, but you prefer not to have the warning. Basically, you are saying my journey with this film is not what the director had planned for me, but there's not much you can do about it. Film necessarily contracts real events. It cannot tell the whole story, whether taken from life or made up. Film selects, and using various techniques, it manipulates our responses primarily to move us through the narrative, but there'll be other reasons as well, and they might be in terms of sympathy or information that's got to be got across, or it might be something pedagogical. When a film is made of a biography, or yet another film is made of an Austen or a Dickens novel, there cannot be one-to-one correspondence. Even if the time fact allowed it, a 12-part series instead of a 90-minute film, the forms will not. The forms are very, very different. But as with The Favourite, as with a good translation, you can convey the sense and sensibility from one form to another, and that can be convincing and authentic. Okay, so let's then think about imaginative space between the various artistic forms. With a novel, you can read a page and then put the book down and ponder what you've read. You can bring in memory and knowledge and other books. You can consider moral possibilities and ethical dilemmas. When you read a book, you add to it as you go along. You add to it and you also control the time. Because when you read, you go at your own pace, the novelist's persuasive tools notwithstanding. With the various streaming services, with so much film now being consumed in the home, we could watch in the same way as we read, but we don't. The film nearly always sets the pace, and if you don't like it, usually throw the film over and search for something else. The imaginative space is different for film than for a book. Sure, we can and do reflect on a film. Excuse me. We can and do reflect on a film once it's over, but it's rarely to the same extent to the thoughts and analysis we give to a book as we are reading. There is, I am suggesting, more of a reader in a book than a viewer in a film. And many people might take me to task for that, and I look forward to the discussion. But again, this suggests that a film can never accurately replicate a book because our response is so different for the two forms. Although, if its replication one is wanting exactly the same information, why bother with the film at all? There's one more thing I want to talk about here in terms of how we will understand a film and its reliability and authenticity. I've got a cough again, excuse me. And this is the notion of personal allegiance, a stakeholder allegiance, and cinematic entertainment. Consider all those films set in ancient or medieval times. Spartacus, Troy, Gladiator, a much better role for Russell Crowe, Joan of Arc, The Agony and the Ecstasy, that one was about Michelangelo, Beloved Infidel, Beethoven. I'm sure I'm not alone in admitting that much of my exposure to history came through film and novels. It never bothered me that these works weren't absolutely accurate. They gave me, at the very least, the bare bones. And if I wanted to know more, then I went to the library. Today, people would probably go to the web and Wikipedia. But when a film draws on something I know about, when I have a personal allegiance to the material, a stake in it, then my response is very different. It's like my friend with the Alan Turing film. In 1997, an Italian film directed by and starring the comedian Roberto Benigni was released. It was called Life is Beautiful. This was a feel-good film set in Auschwitz. I hated it. It was intended to be a film about the power of the human spirit, and it might have been, but at the same time it trashed the horrors of Auschwitz. It obliterated all the inhumanities that went on there as it was trying to show one father's humanity. Not only did it not reveal anything new or different about how Auschwitz could have been created and supported by so many, it actually hid the facts. Anyone seeing that film with only a little knowledge of the death camps would have come out feeling quite jolly and wondering what the Jews were complaining about. I, on the other hand, being possessed of detailed knowledge of Auschwitz, I, having known survivors who lost all their family in Auschwitz, I, who have actually trod that fraught ground of Auschwitz, was appalled. I was also personally affronted. A film that had been authentic enough to some people was an affront to history and to me. This film won praise and prizes. This film clearly worked cinematically, but it did not work for me, nor did it work for historical truth. Another example of when personal allegiance affected my response to a film that was considered cinematically successful was Iris. I have long read and admired Iris Murdoch. I started as a teenager, and even though she's been dead nearly 20 years, I still read her today. Iris is one of my life's companions. I have read several memoirs about her and biographies too. I know Iris, and I've also written about Iris. When Iris died, I was the one that wrote a piece for the paper for her. I'm an Iris person. I absolutely hated the books written by her husband John Bailey after her death. So when the film Iris was produced based on Bailey's memoir of the same name, I should have been warned off. I should have had more sense than to see it. The best I can say about the experience is that the session my partner and I went to was largely empty. I cried hysterically through much of the film. I, a woman who prides herself on being emotionally restrained, was a blubbering mess. So much emphasis was placed on the poor old dear with dementia, while the great philosopher that Iris Murdoch was warranted hardly a mention, similarly her novels, all 24 of them. Instead, we see her lying in bed watching Teletubbies. It was dreadful, it was cruel, it was distressing. Others liked the film, considered it a sensitive film about dementia. But it wasn't about dementia, I wanted to shout. It was supposed to be about Iris Murdoch. They were no wiser about the great Iris Murdoch at the conclusion of the film, I can guarantee that. So a film can lack authenticity and truth and still be considered a successful film. Such films have a cinematic logic to them. The narrative holds together. The film is, in short, entertaining or informative about dementia, although it clearly was not for me, given my personal stake in the life and work of Dame Iris Murdoch. Truth, accuracy, authenticity. Storytelling, narrative coherence, entertainment. Values, attitudes, allegiances. All these features are relevant before the lights go down. I look forward to our discussion.